everybody, and welcome to Hornsby Library. My name's Melanie and I'm the Programs Librarian here. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Darug and Guringai people, and I recognise the continuing connection to land, culture, community and story. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Tonight, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce you all to Julie Janson. Julie's a teacher, an award-winning poet, playwright, artist and novelist, whose latest book is a novel called Benevolence, and we're here to celebrate this book tonight. Julie is a woman of the Darug Aboriginal Nation. We're going to have time for questions at the end of the talk, and you'll all be able to see at the bottom of your screen there's a Q&A box, so you can type any questions that you have in there and we'll get to them at the end of the talk. Julie, welcome. We're so pleased to have you here tonight.
Thank you very much, Melanie. I'm very pleased to be here. So I'll just say my welcome, Kwaibija Jamna Payala Yanawi, which is in Darug language, which says, welcome, let's all come together and talk.
Thank you, Julie. I'm so pleased that we are here on Darug land and that we're able to have some Darug language spoken, so thank you for that.
Good.
Julie, Benevolence is a historical novel about the early years of the colonisation of Australia, and you've described it as a First Nations response to The Secret River by Kate Grenville. Can you tell us a little bit about the novel and what inspired you to write it?
Okay. I think that even though it seems rather strange to have been inspired by reading a novel that really moved me, a very important novel, The Secret River. But at the end of The Secret River, there's a scene where there's a really big massacre. The whole novel actually leads up to the massacre of Darug people, Barrabarungal people in particular, along the Hornsby River. And that's the nation that I'm descended from, Barrabarungal people, who my family actually came from an area at Freeman's Reach, which is near Wilberforce, which is near Windsor, out on the Hornsby River. And when I actually saw the play adaptation of Kate Grenville's book by Andrew Bavell, he did the play adaptation. I saw it twice at the Sydney Theatre Company and also down in Adelaide. And when I got to the end of the play, I sat there with tears just pouring down my face each time. I found it so moving. But it wasn't just that it was moving. I also felt really sad that a story had been told that was so factually incorrect. And that, you know, this novel had gone on to, and the play had gone on to tour the world, and the novel had been a best-selling novel. And I just felt that it was telling a story of all of my ancestors, of all being dead, and that there's nobody left. And if that is so, who am I? And who are the 6,000 people living in the Blacktown area alone who identify as Barrabarungal Darug people? And so I really felt we'd sold a bit of a pup in that regard to have that story told. And it's no criticism of Kate herself. I've actually met her. She's a wonderful writer and I have great respect for her and her work. And then at that time I was working for Professor Peter Reid, who's a very well-known historian who actually came up with the term the stolen generation. He's worked for many times with Aboriginal people and with Coral Edwards set up Link Up, which links up Aboriginal people with their families from when they've been stolen from their families. And I was working for Peter Reid as a senior researcher at Sydney University in the history department. And we were doing research on the history of Aboriginal people in the Sydney Basin. And for 5 years, I was one of his senior researchers, along with some other people of Aboriginal descent who were also researchers. And I kept hearing these amazing stories at the Hawkesbury of how people survived over time. And they're exactly like the stories that were about my family, mainly that Aboriginal women had married often convict men and had worked as servants. And the men usually had lowly jobs like log splitters, and nobody could read or write. Every certificate that I ever found from my family, they just had a cross because they couldn't read or write. And these stories rang all these bells for me, and I thought, oh look, when we put this website up, historyofaboriginalsydney.edu.au, there'll be someone sitting somewhere like in their office in London, and they'll go, gee, this is a good story. I think I'll write a novel. And I thought, I'd better get in first and write the first Darug Barrabarungal version of that history of the Hawkesbury River.
I think that
long answer.
Oh, it's a wonderful answer, and I think we're so pleased that you did that. There's elements of the story that reflect your own family history.
Yeah.
Touched on this a little bit, but so what sort of research process did you go through to find out that history, and how did you fill in the gaps? Because I assume that it wasn't all there just ready for you to jot down quickly.
If only. If you're if you're a Burraburrungal person and you're descended from a very famous woman called Maria Locke, and there are many, many descendants of Maria Locke, thousands of, then you came into the written history of the colony way back in the time of Governor Lachlan Macquarie. So there's lots of information about the Locke family and how Maria Locke was married to a man called Colby, and Colby was a black tracker for Governor Lachlan Macquarie, and there's all sorts of information. But for the humble people on my side of the family who couldn't read or write, there was very little information. And I really realised it was a history of servants. And, you know, one of my grandmothers was in fact a servant after she came out of an orphanage. She grew up in an orphanage and then she became a servant. But how do you find the information? One, you've got to have a really good imagination, but I have found many, many certificates, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates. But whenever there's a missing certificate, you often know that's the Aboriginal part of the family when there's missing. And I couldn't find a birth certificate for 3 times great a grandmother, who's the equivalent of my Muraging in my novel. For years I just thought, oh well, you just have to accept that there is no certificate, because a lot of Aboriginal children born in the early 1800s didn't have any certificates, or were even recorded in a church records. But then one day I struck gold, and I decided to leave out the father's name, which is what I thought his name was, Henry Thomas, and just put you know, Mary Thomas as the mother and the child as Mary, and sent it off, and suddenly I got this certificate back which named a certain reverend of the church from Windsor, a very famous reverend of the church, exactly the same name as the father of the child. And now my husband, who is also studies history, said, oh no, that can't be possible. He would be a very well-respected man, as if that would happen. And I kind of looked at him and I thought, well, I don't know about that. You know, maybe it isn't true, but it's a good story. And it explained all sorts of things about why there was missing information about her. And so it was that notion that made me begin to invent the story of Muraging Mary James, to base it on the idea that she was born to an Aboriginal mother and a Reverend father.
I cannot begin to imagine how excited the novelist in you must have been when you came across that. That would have been
scandal.
Julie, your dad, who was Aboriginal, didn't often like to speak about his Aboriginal heritage.
Yeah.
So at what stage in your life did you start to become more connected?
Well, look, my dad looked a bit like Adam Goods, very tall, dark and handsome. Whenever he went in the sun, he just turned black, which is, you know, what often happens to people of Aboriginal descent. They just go very dark when they're in the sun. And Dad, certainly his behaviour was extremely Aboriginal. He could shimmy up a tree with an axe in the back of his pocket to cut out, you know, honey out of a tree, or he used to take us kids along the Lane Cove River, of all things, to collect oysters of an afternoon in big sacks, and taught us how to go fishing for blue swimmer crabs on the Lane Cove River. So why we didn't die? They were pumping sewage into the river in those days. Anyway, we didn't seem to think that. And Dad acted as if he was living in the bush, and he was in the middle of Sydney. He was in Hunters Hill, of all things. But, you know, in those days, I think it was just called Boronia Park Housing Commission. We were the Hunters. And when people say, oh, you grew up in Hunters Hill, I say, well, sort of, not really. But, you know, his family never really talked about Aboriginal heritage. It was a taboo for all sorts of reasons. The racism of the day was horrific. If you mentioned that people were Aboriginal, people would almost spit with the terrible racism, even in the city, and especially in country towns. Dad grew up part of his life out in Taree, and he'd go to the local shops with his brothers, and Dad would be made to stand outside with his younger brother because they were the dark ones, and the fair one could go in and get the lollies, and Dad wasn't allowed in the shop. But, you know, I was just always really curious because people were always, you know, members of the family would call me a little white black fella, and I just was always a mystery. And Dad had come home from work at the fire brigade, and he had, if he'd said he was Aboriginal, he wouldn't have been able to get that job at the fire brigade there was actually a law which said you couldn't work for a government organisation if you're Aboriginal. So he kept quiet. And he actually ended up being an officer, which is amazing. He left school when he was 13, only started school when he was 8, never wore shoes. So it's a miracle, really. And he'd bring home cardboard didgeridoos and boomerangs. And we'd go, well, what do you got them for, Dad? And all the blokes at work used to call him Jeddah the Abo. So that was nice. And anyway, I just became very curious. By the time I finished university, I had a burning desire to go and live in Aboriginal communities. So that's what I did for the next 10 years, lived in remote Aboriginal communities. Yeah.
That's wonderful. So, Julie, you tend to focus on historical stories, like both in your novels and in your plays and so on. What is it that draws you to exploring these sorts of stories?
Oh, good question. Well, I studied drama at university and English. Well, I love the English language. Mostly I was studying people like Jane Austen or Henry Fielding or something, it's kind of like, they weren't even Australian. I think we got Patrick White, that was the big,
yes.
No women, Judith Wright maybe, if you were really lucky. And that was about it. It was always Lord Byron or something like that. But I studied history and I developed a passion for history. I was always good at history at school. And it naturally led me to reading Australian history. And I've realised as years have gone by that the history that we're often fed in Australia is one of colonial patriarchy, and there's just another story to tell. I think it's time to write back the history from other points of view. I'd like to see a Chinese version of Australian history. Chinese people have been in Australia since the early 1800s, certainly during the gold years, 1860, or an Afghan version. Without the Afghan camel drivers, there'd be no inland settlements in Australia. The Afghan camel drivers provided all the skills in order for that to happen. So I just think we've got an interesting multicultural country, and our history is like that as well. And it's really time to kind of, they call it the subaltern writes back if you're studying Indian literature. The subaltern meaning the lowly person in the army, and that they write back a different type of story. And I just think it is time to write back and say, well, look, there is another way of looking at these stories, and that's what led me to write Benevolence and the other novels I've written.
Yeah, well, I think given that our Prime Minister only recently realised that we had slavery in Australia, that it would be a lovely thing to have some more different points of view.
Different points of view. Well, when I was only in my mid-20s, I went to work on an Aboriginal cattle station, which I talk about in my novel, The Crocodile Hotel. I'm calling it an Aboriginal cattle station. It wasn't owned by Aboriginal people. It was owned by a Hong Kong consortium with a white manager who used to take the whip out to the children if they got too close to his fence. And none of the men on that cattle station were paid for their work at all the women. And there were 400 people living on that cattle station. And I worked there as a teacher. So I had a very, very, there was only 2 families who weren't of the Alawa people. And, one was me and my young husband, and the other one was the station manager and his family. And those people were virtually imprisoned on their own land, only allowed to occupy 1 square kilometre and of the land, and the rest was cut off so that the cattle could use it. And the cattle destroyed the billabongs, and that was slavery. The people were paid with a packet of tobacco, a piece of meat, and a bag of flour. And the station manager took all of their welfare money that they got from the Australian government, and then would sell them things like, Donald Cook's baby carrots in tins, or tinned powdered ice cream or something from a store they set up on the cattle station, and basically ripped them off, So there's definitely slavery, and that was just in the late 1970s, and those people there didn't managed to buy their own cattle station until 15 years later. Under the land rights legislation, they were able to purchase it through the Indigenous Land Corporation. Yeah, but I saw slavery with my own eyes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess let's all keep talking about these stories so that nobody can have the excuse of ignorance anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah. Julie, something that I really loved about this book is, even though it is sad at times, it's also full of life and of hope. It's got love and romance, and it's very funny. There's a scene where Mary gets into a bit of trouble with her lover's jealous wife, and you know, how difficult was it for you to find that balance to get that quite the way you wanted it?
Well, I love writing scenes like that because I started my life as a playwright, right? And I do hear the voices, and I love writing dialogue. I mean, Mugabala, who were absolutely wonderful. Without them, I wouldn't have this book. Mugabala stayed with me for 5 years editing that book with me. And they initially said, oh, there's too much dialogue in some of these scenes. And I was like, do whatever you like, but don't take away my dialogue. I really love the dialogue because then the people really come to life for me. And the scenes of sexual jealousy, well, you know, I know a lot of human beings have experienced that in their life, you know, and it's a normal human emotion and one that a lot of people can identify with. So I actually really enjoy writing those kinds of scenes because I get right inside it and kind of, you know, do all the voices in front of the computer and, you know, get to be an actress again, you know. And so they're my most pleasurable scenes, really, when I write those sort of scenes. And love scenes too, you know. I think love and passion. I learned a few lessons from the first novel, The Crocodile Hotel. I had a bit of criticism from that, people saying, oh, you know, my mother said to the old ladies who I went to present the book to was, I've told you this story before, but I'll tell it again. My old mother said, oh, here's my daughter, Julie, who went to work with the Aborigines. Mum never admitted she married an Aboriginal man, right? And she'd say, and she's written a book about it, but there's a lot of sex in this book and none of it's true. She was a very respectable married woman at the time, which is actually the truth. But when it came to writing a novel, it was much more interesting to have a character who was single, you know, who had a kind of slightly more interesting time than, yes, I slept with my husband every night for 2 years, you know. So, anyway, but Mugabala, when I did the first drafts of this book, you know, Rachel bin Salah, who stood by me with this book right from the beginning, is wonderful. She's one of the commissioning editors for Mugabala. She said, Julie, there's a scene missing when the, you know, Reverend and Mary, you know, get together and there is a baby born. So there's a scene missing. And I'm like, yes, you know, what scene's that? And she said, you know, there's a scene of, you know, of the sex, you know. And I was like, oh no, look, I'm just going to get into trouble, you know, if I write that scene. I really would rather leave it out. You know, I'm more sophisticated writer now, you know, I'm not going to write scenes like that. Because I have a lot of gentlemen that I know in the area that I live in, they'd sidle up to me and go, I've read your book. and I'd be like, yes, it's about land rights. And they said, I like the dirty bits. and you're like, it's a book about land rights. Anyway, so you know, Mugabala convinced me that I should write a scene like that. And I thought, all right, I'll make you a scene that'll sear off the paper. But the book's more than that. And there's a romantic love. And yeah. Well, I read that little bit about when...
Oh, I would love you to do a reading.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Well, our character, I don't want to do too many spoilers for the book, but anyway, a character of Muraging runs away from the school in Parramatta, native school, when she's already in puberty, say 14 or 15, and she runs away with a young Aboriginal man who's come from the mountains, a Gunnegarra man, and who doesn't speak much English, but he's very beautiful and keeps coming and knocking on her window. And finally she succumbs to wanting to run away with him, you know, at that age when young women are interested in young men. And so this is, Mary runs away with Boothry. Mary and Boothry are tired and stop to drink from a creek. The dogs in the settler shacks bark at them, and Boothry hisses a peculiar sound like a dingo, and the dogs fall silent. The land is newly logged, and broken trees litter the ground. It is a kind of sorrow for them to witness this new Waibala destruction. Through the trees, they hear the banging of stone against stone and the sharp crack of sledgehammers as convicts build a new road. The couple skirt the edges of the clearing up the mountain, where Aboriginal tracks have long been, but they avoid all contact out of fear of attack. Boothry is strong and certain, and he will lead her to the promised land like Moses did. He bends down beside a creek and scoops fresh water into his mouth. He cups his hands for Mary to drink, and his fingertips brush her throat. He grins. Now her life is with Boothary. She is brave with him, and his voice seems to come directly from the mountains and rivers. Now she will be Jinmang, wife.
That's lovely. Thank you, Julie. Something that we heard a little bit in the reading that you did and that I really enjoyed throughout the book is that you use a lot of language, of Darug language.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that process and why you included it?
Yeah, look, I think it's really important. Recently, there was a beautiful book written by Tara June Winch where she uses Wiradjuri language. And it really is the whole centre of the book about what that Wiradjuri language is. And I just think it's very important to be able to make these languages live again. And someone like Kim Scott did it in his novel that Dead Men Dance as well. It is a challenge to use words that are foreign to your general reader. And it's a way of, I have a way of kind of introducing them and often using English as well. But sometimes if the word's been used a few times, I stop using the English in the assumption that the reader has been attentive and they've picked up what that word means. And it's a way of making the language, Darug language, permeate English language and give us an ear for a language which, you know, should be preserved and brought back to life rather than allowed to die. Yeah.
Absolutely. It was wonderful. I was so pleased that you did that. You've done a wonderful job of writing white characters who aren't necessarily monsters. They're people that seem to have good intentions, although there are terrible consequences nevertheless.
Yes.
Can we talk about the title Benevolence and how it relates to this?
Yes, yes. Well, it's good when you're writing a novel, if you can find a really good title early on, it's very helpful because it helps you to focus your mind. And in the research about my own family, I found out that my great-grandmother, who I remember as a little girl, she used to sit on the steps in Chatswood in the house where 30 people lived in Chatswood down by the Lane Cove River. We'd go there on Sundays and great-great-grandmother Mary Bartle would be sitting in the sun watching us. And when I looked into her history, I realised that she had 3 missing siblings. And those siblings had been given up to the Benevolence Society in Windsor. When I say given up, I don't know, because the records simply say children received by the Benevolence Society, mother unable to feed them, mother unable to care for them. And so that's so few words we've got about what happened to those siblings, other than we know that the mother never saw them again because on her death certificate, she put them all down as deceased, even though she would have never known what happened to them. And so they were my great uncles and aunties, and possibly they lived, I don't know. A lot of children who were taken in by benevolent societies died through lack of nutrition, but the Benevolent Society actually did also tremendous good in places like Windsor, helping old Aboriginal people and ex-convicts, people who were poor, to survive through winters. Gave them blankets, gave them food, and it did have a great benevolence, but it is a two-edged sword, you know, because you're being benevolent to people and at the same time you're taking them away from their families. And we know the terrible destructive things that can happen to people who've been taken from their families, you know, the stolen generation. Yeah.
Absolutely. Julie, is there anything in particular that you hope readers will take away from reading the book?
I hope it'll make them rethink about all Australian history in different ways and look at a different perspective. I mean, obviously it's the Aboriginal stories that draw me most because it's my own family stories, but I just think there are other ways of looking at our history. And it's interesting to have my book come right out when statues are tumbling down all over the world. And I've kind of got mixed feelings about it, but Julia Baird wrote a beautiful, the journalist from ABC, a beautiful article about the tumbling of statues, quite a radical article actually. It gave me a whole new kind of perspective on her. And she said, let's bring these statues down from their pedestals and set them on the ground and surround them with all the people they oppressed. And I thought, what a wonderful idea. So don't just destroy, because you're destroying history in ways if you destroy a statue. Bring Governor Lachlan Macquarie down from his pedestal, stick him on the ground and put around him the Aboriginal people that he had massacred in the Appin Massacre in 1817, you know, who he told his soldiers who were sent out on a punitive expedition to bring back a bag of 10 heads so they could be given to banks in England at the Royal Academy so he could study the skulls. And also he told them to bring back some pretty children. So his wife, Lady Macquarie, Lady Elizabeth Macquarie, could start a school for children out in Parramatta, which is at the beginning of my novel. So to bring back the pretty children after you've pushed their parents over the cliff in Appin. Now, I mean, you know, the ironies of life. And yet Lachlan Macquarie also had a reputation for great kindness. And I also read documents about him, he took all the children from the school and put them in carts and drove them up to George's Heights, you know, near Kirribilli for a picnic, you know, and he gave boats to Bungaree so that Bungaree could go fishing for his family, and had houses built for Bungaree, you know, the Guringai people that he brought to live in George's Heights. So, you know, complex person in a complex time. And I guess he felt justified in sending his soldiers off on a punitive expedition because a whole lot of white settlers had been murdered, you know, had been killed by Aboriginal men from the Ganangara tribe who were trying to get their land back and wanted a sheep, most probably, and some corn. Mm.
Well, I agree with you and Julia. I think it would be good for us to be hearing more of these stories rather than, you know, that's right. I guess tearing everything down doesn't necessarily solve anything, but it would be good for more people to know that this is what.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Who are some of your favourite Aboriginal authors? Are there people that you think should be more widely read?
Well, because I was a playwright, I say was because I guess you always remain a playwright. Some of my plays are still performed. Jack Davis and Bobby Merritt. Bobby Merritt's The Cake Man was the first Aboriginal play I ever saw back in 1975, I think. I was only a young student, and with the wonderful Justine Saunders and Brian Siren in the lead roles, and in the Black Theatre there in Redfern, very famous theatre in a tin shed, and an extraordinary performance, and packed out every night, and you couldn't leave there without being amazed at this story coming to life. It's set on the Curra Mission. And then Jack Davis's plays are being performed often by the Sydney Theatre Company, brought over by the Sydney Theatre Company to be performed in Sydney or at the Opera House, the studio. And Jack Davis's plays, which were written from a very particular Aboriginal point of view in an Aboriginal world. Ava Janson, the Aboriginal playwright, who's often, who's also a great poet. Now, Ava's work isn't often performed much anymore, but her work was breathtaking. Because she was a female Aboriginal playwright, and she often wrote monologues as well for Aboriginal women, which of course you didn't really get with Jack Davis or Bobby Merritt. Mm. So they were my great inspiration. Yeah, and Alexis Wright, her magnificent book, you know, Carpentaria, which is a masterpiece. You know, there are many. Yeah.
Yeah, we so often talk about literature as being, you know, either a mirror or a window, and it's that thing that, you know, the way it acts as a window is really important for us all, but it's also so important for it to be a mirror and to be able to see yourself reflected.
Yes.
Stories.
Well, I remember being at the Opera House studio with a whole lot of Aboriginal students. I taught at the Koori Centre at the University of Sydney for 20 years. And so all of my students were mostly Aboriginal women, but sometimes men from all over New South Wales. And what an extraordinary 20 years it was for me. I learned far more from them than I was able to teach them as a teacher, I can tell you. And we were sitting in the audience watching Jack Davis's play. Was it The Kulak? No, The Dreamers. It was The Dreamers. And in one of the roles was Ernie Dingo playing, you know, the young naughty uncle who likes a drink. And the audience that I'm sitting with, you know, there's about 20 Aboriginal women mostly, and they were cracking themselves up with laughter. They just, even though it's a different language, a Noongar language is a different language, they were screaming with laughter all the way through it, slapping their thighs and yelling, and, you know, and just having the best time. The rest of the audience was very kind of sincere looking kind of non-Aboriginal people who just had these serious, miserable looks on their faces, while all the Aboriginal girls nearly wetting their pants. And finally, Ernie Dingo looked up from the audience and says, "Hey, you mob, you know, just be quiet for a minute. You know, let us let's get on with this play. So anyway, that was great. Which leads me to when I wrote the play Gungies, which is a play about Aboriginal death in custody, which is performed every year at WAPA in West Australia at the Academy of Performing Arts by the Aboriginal students. Anyway, and it was on in Sydney, and Mama Shirl, who's a very famous Aboriginal matriarch from Redfern. There's a statue of Mama Shirl in Redfern. It's a miracle, a miracle. Mama Shirl was in the audience, and I don't think Mama Shirl had been to the theatre before, right? And so she's sitting in the audience, not far from where I was sitting. I don't know why I was watching my own play, mostly just total egotism or something. Anyway, I'm sitting there in the audience, and one of my friends, John Sheeran, was playing the role of the policeman who kills a young Aboriginal man, right, called Steve, in custody. It's a terrible scene. But anyway, and in this scene, you know, he's kind of about to kind of punch the young Aboriginal man, and Mama Shirl leapt up from her seat and started shouting out, "You Gungy B, you let him go or I'll come up and thump you." And poor John's, you know, he's at Belfast Street Theatre trying to get on with the play. And Mama Shirl's, and everyone's going, "Mama Shirl, sit down, it's theatre, Mama Shirl, it's not real, sit down." It was wonderful. And then afterwards in the foyer, we all stood around to have a couple of lemonades before we all went home. And Mama Shirl came out, and John came out from having had a shower, this white actor. She walks up to him again and kind of grabs him by the shirt and said, "You should have let that boy go." Oh, gee, it was great.
Oh, I'm sure that every storyteller dreams of having their story so well responded to.
It's wonderful.
Now, everybody, I'm coming close to the end of my questions, and then we'll go over to audience questions. So please feel free, as we say, type anything you like into the Q&A box, and we'll come to that soon. So I understand that you're working on a new novel that's about the death of the Darling River.
Yes.
Tell us anything about that.
Well, it's interesting that you should ask me that just after talking about the play Gungies. The play Gungies was nominated for an Augie Award, actually, which didn't win, but it was nominated. But that play has always been quite close to my heart because it was a painful play to write, but I also had a lot of help from students who I was teaching at the University of Sydney at the time. We used to do a lot of improvisations. I think they just thought I was a very badly prepared lecturer, and I had prepared no notes for the day, so I just get them to get up and improvise. Anyway, I wrote that play, Gungies, and I just thought, look, it would make a really good novel. So I used that as the basis of writing a novel about the death of the Darling River, but it's also about a death in custody. So it's you've got to love the novel you're working on now, otherwise you never ever finish it, because they take 5 years to write. Good God, any sane person would give up. Write a poem, it's much quicker. So yeah, I've had some Aboriginal consultants work, because it's not my country, it's Nyempa country and Gamaroi country that I'm writing about. So I've had one Gamaroi elder who's been reading drafts for me, which has been really good, and that's appropriate protocol, for anybody, whether Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal, if you're going to write about a certain clan, to make sure that you go through your protocols and permissions. And so I'm about, I guess some people would say I'm only at first draft, but I'm about third or fourth draft. And Mugabala is waiting for me to submit it formally, but I'm really looking for a publisher for that. But when the River Darling dried up, I was so heartbroken because I lived along the River Darling in Burke with people who were Nyempa people. And so I felt and I was part of the corroboree movement along the river last year, with Bruce Shillingsworth, who spoke so passionately on Q&A about the death of the Darling River, and went to the corroborees that he organised through Yamanyanga Baka was the name of the corroborees. And so that's what that novel's about, yeah.
Oh, it sounds wonderful. We'll look forward to it.
Good.
I'd also like to ask you more about what you talked about protocols, because something that I observe, if I go to a writers' festival or something like that and a speaker on a panel is Aboriginal or of colour, there's always a white lady who asks questions about, having permission to write stories that are not their own. And honestly, they often don't like the answers that they get. And of course, I mean, no one person can decide on behalf of all their people what is and is okay. But as you say, there are protocols, there are ways about
and
approaching.
Look, I actually, maybe I have a different opinion to some other people of Aboriginal descent, but I actually encourage Australians to embrace their history. And if they don't embrace some Aboriginal aspect of the history, then they're ignoring the history. You can't keep writing stories about nice English people, you know, with their, you know, crocheted, you know, doilies and teacups, and because it just simply doesn't represent Australia totally. And I just think that if you want to include some Aboriginal characters, then you just need to go onto the website of the Australia Council, and there's a whole list of protocols, and not get put off because there's pages and pages of it. But basically it just means have some good manners and show some respect. And you can find ways of getting in contact with Aboriginal people if they're the particular clan you want to write about. And that you should sit down and have some good, serious and respectful conversations. And if you actually want to use some material, then you should pay for it. You know, just that, like any person who comes and works for you, if I have an editor work for me, I have to pay them $3,000, you know, so that there's money exchanged, and that there's just, I mean, I wouldn't attempt to write a book with, you know, Chinese characters unless I spent a bit of time getting to know some Chinese community and I felt that they approved of what I was doing. I just think it's a matter of common respect, that's all. But I don't think people should be afraid of it. I really actually think it's a challenge they should take on, yeah.
Fair enough. I'm going to go to some audience questions, and we have one from Tracy. Hello, Tracy, and thank you for asking a question. She's asked, in your experience, how has the study of Australian history changed in universities over the duration of your academic career?
Well, I can mostly speak about, because I've worked as a school teacher for many years. I went back to teaching in schools about 10 years ago as a high school teacher. All I can say is don't do it. No. It's terrifying. But anyway, certainly in Australian, in New South Wales schools, the syllabus requires Year 9 students, every single one of them, to spend 6 months studying Aboriginal history. And it's such a change from when I was a child or at school. And the curriculum materials were so wonderful, and the supporting books and the support that you got from the Aboriginal unit at the Department of Education, that there was absolutely no excuse for any teacher to say that they didn't know about Aboriginal history. You know, and I just think I think we should be proud of that as New South Wales people, and not always kind of, you know, cringe with kind of like, oh, we haven't done the right thing. I actually think that so many institutions, whether they're medical or social work or education, do try incredibly hard to stop that gap, you know, and to work with Aboriginal people. And I just think it's a work in progress for everybody, and we just all keep working on it, you know.
Absolutely. Julie, I know that you're part of a writers group, and I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that and how important it is as a writer to have those sorts of support networks in place. Well,
through the New South Wales Writers Centre, which is now called Writing New South Wales, the wonderful organisation. Totally, anybody who wants to write and they're just beginning, or even if they're an accomplished writer and they want to brush up some skills, there's always a course. And nowadays a whole lot of the courses are online while we've got COVID-19. And I was there at a particular course. I think it was Linda Furnell's course on editing or something. She's a wonderful teacher. And because I always feel I love doing courses. I can always learn something. There's always something for me to learn. People say, oh, why don't you teach them? I'm like, I'd much rather do them. I've been a teacher most of my life. I don't want the responsibility anymore. Too much preparation. And I met this wonderful woman called Geraldine. She was sitting there outside of Linda Furnell's class, and she had on these beautiful glasses like stars, and her name was Geraldine Starr. And I walked up and I said, she had bright red hair. I said, you look extraordinary. I said, I must get to know you. And she said, okay, all right, I'm a writer too. And we started to have a conversation, and there was another woman who came and joined us. We literally, the four of us just met at that course, and we've been meeting for 5 years. Yeah. We meet once a month at the New South Wales State Library in a meeting room, and sometimes it's absolutely hilarious. The librarians outside look through the glass with this wonder, because at one stage I was trying to work out a rape scene for a particular thing I was writing, and Geraldine said, "Let's just act it out." So she had me up against the wall, so we could work out where the hands went and where the arm was, and the librarians were looking on in kind of, surprise. But they've been a great help to me, and I hope I've been a great help to them. We inspire each other and we encourage each other. Yeah.
Oh, Julie, it sounds like every writer needs a Geraldine to help them out when they're a little bit stuck.
She's a wonderful novelist too, and it helps you in those dark days when you can't get published. Because your little writers group goes, "How ridiculous, your book's so much better than, John Smith's book." We lie to each other. It's lovely.
We all need to be surrounded by people who are prepared to tell us the occasional beautiful lie, I think.
Yes, exactly.
You touched on this a little earlier, Julie, but so you were a senior researcher at the University of Sydney and you contributed research to the website that's called The History of Aboriginal Sydney.
Yes.
A little bit about the work you did there?
Well, it was a wonderful job because I was paid to do things that I love, which was I worked with a young filmmaker, Lisa Kinchilla. No, sorry, I've forgotten her name. Anyway, she worked with me to do the actual filming. I'm not particularly good at technical stuff, but I would do the interviews with mostly Aboriginal elders. In the Aboriginal community, you'll find that if you've approached a group, the young people are often quite reluctant to talk. They will always say, "No, you need to talk to Auntie so-and-so." There's a huge amount of respect for older people in the Aboriginal community, which is wonderful when you get to be as old as I am, because people are really nice to you. And I got to interview all these extraordinary people and hear these amazing stories, and they would write the document which they give permission for that story to be put on the website. And some of the older people, there was one particular lady, and I won't mention her name, up in Singleton, who came to see us when we were in a community centre talking to various Aboriginal people from the Wanarua clan up there in Singleton. It was supposed to be Sydney, but we began to spread because so many people wanted us to come and record these stories to put them on the internet so their grandchildren could see them. Also the text, also all the research that you do in libraries like the Mitchell Library or at the New South Wales Archives, all those wonderful free resources that we have here in New South Wales. And this particular old lady was sitting there with her daughter clutching a piece of paper. And I went up to her daughter and I said, yeah, she said, "Oh, this is my mum and she wants to read something to you on the camera to put on the internet." And I said, "Oh, okay, all right." And so she came in, she was quite nervous, the old lady, and she unrolled her piece of paper and she began to read this story that she'd written. And she said, "When I was a little girl, I lived in the bush in Singleton with my mum and my brother. And my mum would make a new camp every night. And our house was a piece of square of lino that she would put down on the ground near the fire, and she would use a pot to cook up a stew or something for us. And every morning she would sweep it, a piece of lino, and she'd roll it up and put it under her arm, and we'd move to another camp." And she said, when I was a little girl, I thought this was great fun, except if it was raining and we only had a really leaky tent. And eventually Mum took me to Newcastle and I went to live with my white auntie because Mum couldn't afford to keep us. And as the old lady told us this story, tears were just pouring down her face. And she said, "And I just want to say, how my mother loved me and how she tried so hard." She said, "But the police always hunted her out of town and always tried to take her children. And if it wasn't for my mum constantly on the move and looking after us kids, we would have been taken and put into care. And I wouldn't be the person I am today, and I'm at university because my mum protected me from the police." And she told this story and and that was the kind of stories that people told us. So, and it was a great gift for me to hear those stories with their permission for them to be on the internet. Well, those stories are all there on the internet. There's hundreds of little short videos, very good resource for teachers, historyofaboriginalsydney.edu.au. Free for anyone.
What a wonderful resource. I hope that people who haven't had a chance to have a look at it yet do take the time to have a look.
Yeah.
I think people are a little bit shy about asking questions when we're on.
That's okay.
got a lovely comment from Denise, who just wanted to let you know how much she's enjoyed tonight and said that you've made her laugh out loud many times. So just letting us know. Thank you for giving us your company tonight.
Buy the book.
Absolutely, buy the book.
It's only $20. Buy two.
Well, at least. At least. It's got to be.
I'm only joking.
Oh, no. Come on. It's got to be coming up to an important occasion for someone we all know.
I am on the book show week after next on ABC.
Oh, really? That'll be wonderful.
Well, they interviewed me, and then they said, of course, you know, this interview is being paired with an interview with Kate Grenville. And I kind of went, oh. Because she's such a famous, a wonderful writer, you know, and I'm Mrs. Nobody.
Oh.
And I'm like, okay. So I was really happy that I hadn't said anything too negative, you know. I was just like, oh, God. Anyway.
Oh, we'll all be able to keep an eye out for that.
Yeah. It'll be in about 2 weeks, I think, the book show.
So everybody, thank you for joining us this evening. And I would like to remind you that copies of Benevolence are available to purchase from our favourite bookseller, Novella, at Wahroonga, or, of course, your local independent bookseller, wherever you are. And
you can get it from the library.
Well, that's what I was going to say. We, of course, have copies of it at the library. You can come and see us. We're open again now, so you can come in and borrow it from us. But, you know, when you're out buying, always try and remember your local independent bookseller, because times have not been easy for them, and it's better for us to give our money to them than to Mr. Amazon.
Oh, you're so political.
Who I suggest doesn't need it. Now, can I say, just as I'm wrapping up, I can see that people have started to pop off some questions into
Okay.
So I'm going to step back and have a look. Bear with me while I open it up.
Okay.
Oh, look, somebody, Jan, thank you so much. Jan bought the book during the presentation. Well done, Jan. Lots of people are just saying thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We really appreciate it, and thank you for letting know that you enjoyed it, because it means a lot to us.
I really want to thank Melanie, because without her, you know, other libraries just cancelled me because of the COVID, and Melanie has really gone to all this trouble to make sure this happens, and Hornsby Libraries has been a great supporter of me, and I'm just so grateful. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Julie. We always love to have you back here. So, you know, one of the good things that comes out of COVID is that even when you aren't so close to us anymore, we still might be able to keep doing talks. Something that I've heard Julie say is that to have a courageous life is to have an interesting life. And I think that Julie has had a very interesting life indeed. Please, everybody, join me in thanking Julie Janson so much for a wonderful evening. Julie, thank you very much, and good night.
Good night. Thank you, Melanie. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.